Welcome back, everyone. I'm delighted to introduce our second speaker for this afternoon's presentations. Professor Erika Doss, Distinguished Professor in the Edith O'Donnell Institute of Art History at UT Dallas, is going to deliver a talk today titled Public Art, Land Art, Public Art. Please welcome Erika to the podium.
Hi, everybody. Can you hear me? Am I shouting? Am I popping? Am I okay? All right. Thank you for sticking it out. Although it's nicer in here than it is out there with the dinosaurs, etc. All right. So, thank you for joining me here at the Texas State Fairgrounds. Day 2 of the Symposium Groundswell, Women of Land Art. I'm really delighted to be here to celebrate the women artists involved in this program, in this exhibit, and the outstanding work that they produced during this era, this continuing era, as I want to talk about, of land art. So tasked with discussing the intersections among and between land art and public art, I want to start with this photograph of this project and the place and the space that it occupies, which is, 200 feet right over there. So afterwards, hopefully, we're all going to walk around in the humidity and mugginess of it all, or maybe not, and see this space. So this is obviously Patricia Johanson's Fair Park Lagoon, a project that started in 1981 when Patricia was asked to redesign and renovate a swampy and degraded man-made waterway originally constructed in 1936. This large, shallow lake, which was named the Leonhardt Lagoon, was originally constructed, as I said, in 1936 and named after Dorothy Leonhardt, Dallas philanthropist. It was intended as a quiet, restful spot in the midst of the pavilions and the pageants that constitute the Texas State Fair and the Texas Centennial Exposition, which was held in 1936. This was a 6-month fair, in particular, that attracted 6 million people and marked the 100-year anniversary of Texas's independence from Mexico. It's huge. And this is how the Park Esplanade was lit up every night in this particular space. Okay, Fair Park actually existed since the turn of the last century, early 20th century, about 1908, I believe. And in the mid-1930s, the renovation of Fair Park was a federally funded public art project. It was a federally funded public art project from 1934 to 1936 that was paid for by the New Deal's PWA, the Public Works Administration, the CCC, the Civilian Conservation Corps, and the WPA, the Works Progress Administration. They spent over $25 million and employed thousands of workers to transform the Texas State Fairgrounds into an Art Deco showcase. The 1936 exposition featured over 50 exhibition buildings, some of which still stand, including this one. Also the original home of the Dallas Museum of Art. The lagoon was built just south of the Midway, and I've sort of got it, I think, circled with a little red line. And this was the civic section that architect George Dahl for the fair called the civic section that included the art museum, this natural history museum, an aquarium, and a band shell. This was a massive public art project, over 277 acres. And today, of course, it's the site of a massive state fair. This is the largest state fair in the United States, and it opens next week in 5 days. I am relatively new to the Dallas area, so I'm a little enthusiastic about this. I'm just amazed. Dinosaurs? Anyhow, this mini history of the Texas State Fairgrounds is actually the origin story for Fair Park Lagoon, a public art project proposed in the 1980s that rehabilitated a public art project that was made in the 1930s. Note Big Tex's big arm on the top left of the photo, and the big blue over here, and the big blue Ferris wheel, the Texas Star Ferris wheel in the background. This is the context for this land art. Dallas's major example of a large land art project from this time period in this exhibit, Groundswell, and it's a great point of entry for talking about these connections between public art, public art, which we're concerned with this afternoon and throughout this whole entire symposium. So this afternoon, I want to focus on several different approaches to public art programming in the past century, many of them fronted by the federal government. I'm going to start with the New Deal. The era of the New Deal, approximately 1934 to 1945, with some projects being continued into 1947 or when funding entirely ran out, is the first dramatic surge of public art in this country in the 20th century. It's created and caused by the exigencies of the Great Depression, 25% unemployment, which demanded dramatic social change. The election of Franklin Delano Roosevelt in 1933 led to the making of the New Deal. All sorts of alphabet agencies, social agencies, political agencies, economic agencies, with the primary focus on, what's the primary focus of all of those WPA agencies, those New Deal agencies? Putting people back to work, exactly. So that included the artists that we see here. Why is it important to put artists back to work? Because you don't want them in the streets. I'm not kidding. Lots of people were considering voting socialist. They were considering voting alternative political forms in the 1930s. These were smart projects engaged in keeping people working, and work, of course, is the identity that we have as Americans. Without work, many of us get depressed, feel lost, don't feel like we're real Americans. So artists are employed through the WPA and multiple other New Deal art projects, and they work in the ways that we see here. They worked on diverse projects. We're perhaps most familiar with the Treasury Department's participation in public art in the 1930s with all of the murals that the Treasury Department sponsored. Treasury Department sponsored murals in schools, hospitals, public libraries, all sorts of spaces. I want to emphasize, too, the diversity of style for New Deal art. I love this comparison between Louise Ronnebeck, who produced this post office mural for a small town in Colorado, Grand Junction, Colorado, and then there's Stuart Davis's abstract mural that was produced for a housing project in New York. So we see a diversity of subject, we see a diversity of style, and we also have an incredible diversity of public artists. Federally funded projects during the New Deal sponsored more work by women artists and artists of color than at any previous moment in American history. That's something to think about. And among those artists were Aaron Douglas, who we see here with his New York Public Library Commission from 1934, with Schomburg on the left at the library that it was eventually installed at and is still at. What's interesting looking at this mural, or this mural panel, is to recognize that Aaron Douglas, 2 years later, was commissioned to produce 4 murals for this Texas Centennial Exposition. Following the theme from slavery to freedom in what was called the Hall of Negro Life. And this was one of the 50 pavilions that was erected for the Texas Centennial Exposition. This hall also displayed the work of some 38 African American artists and an exhibit funded by the Harmon Foundation out of New York as a traveling exhibit. We only have 2 mural panels extant. The hall was destroyed in 1937. It was torn down. The murals were destroyed, except for these 2 panels, which have ended up in art museums around the country. Aaron Douglas also designed the cover of the pavilion's brochure, which featured an essay by W.E.B. Du Bois. So this is public art in the 1930s, and I want to emphasize all of the factors of diversity here. I also want to emphasize the fragility of public art, the fact that this pavilion was torn down and that Aaron Douglas's 2 mural panels of the 4 were destroyed. So I want you to think about the essentially temporary nature of so much of public art. Public art during the New Deal flourished. We see posters such as these, Work Pays America, and these wonderful See America posters, which advertised American national parks. Art classes began and continued in a lot of American schools. How many of you took art in public school? How many of you took an instrument in public school? That started during the New Deal. The New Deal started art classes for public schools, not just private, and also started musician training or instrument training. The New Deal also created the Index of American Design. This was meant to be a gigantic 15-volume encyclopedia of American design throughout the history of the United States up to about 1900. And it was very much a nationalist project to get designers, interior designers, and others to reflect on American design patterns and copy them instead of those from somewhere else, like Europe. And perhaps you're most familiar with the New Deal's production of documentary photography. Some say that Dorothea Lange's photograph on the right, Migrant Mother, is perhaps the most recognizable photograph of the 20th century. And I contrast that with Gordon Parks's wonderful photograph of one of the female janitors in a building in Washington, D.C. So, New Deal public art was public. So not only is it diverse on all of these different levels, but it was also shown to the public. My slides aren't terrific, but this is an exhibit in Macy's department store of watercolors that were made for the Index of American Design. And this was fairly typical. Artists made things, artists showed things, things were displayed. There was a public emphasis in stores, in libraries, in schools, in public parks. Here, for example, is a display of documentary photography, including works by Dorothea Lange and Ben Shahn, and this was shown on the walls of Grand Central Station. Grand Central Palace was one of the larger art galleries there, so as you're running to get your train, you could run in and also see these photographs. This isn't beautiful display, these are not great exhibitions, but it's the stuff, and it's out there, and people were encouraged to see it. And they did. New Deal public art was widespread, and it was incredibly popular. Now, as an historian of American art, it's interesting to me that it's largely been excluded from the history of American art. We simply don't talk about New Deal public art very much in art history, and there are a couple of different reasons. It's considered dated, it's considered official art, it's considered irrelevant in terms of the sort of sweep of modernism. But I want to point out the diversity of styles represented in this slide, where we have, obviously, modernist painting, we have regional painting, we have all sorts of different styles, artists, subjects, etc., represented in New Deal public art. In some cases, New Deal public art was deemed racist, and indeed, some of it certainly was. So there are absolutely valid criticisms to be mounted against some of these examples. Yet the fact of the matter is New Deal art was the first real evidence of a widespread public art movement in this country. And as I've said, it was diverse on so many different levels. If you're interested in New Deal art, let me point out the Living New Deal. This is a really interesting project. It's a huge website. And it is always interested in volunteers, people photographing or documenting New Deal artifacts, New Deal buildings, and submitting them to what we hope will be the largest collection of New Deal material online, publicly accessible. Of course, New Deal public art was also a temporary work relief program. And so when Americans started to go back to work, 1941, during the war, these programs were eliminated. And by the middle of the 1940s, most of the New Deal programs were axed, and concurrently, public art seemingly disappeared from the American scene. It's not surprising that after World War II, we don't see New Deal, regionalist, et cetera, kind of art. We see abstract expressionism, and we see a lot of emphasis on galleries, markets, museums. But 20 years later, in the 1960s, with the advent of the Johnson administration's Great Society, public art reappears, or I think is rebirthed in the United States. So a second major public art push in the United States is really the push that's going to be made by the General Services Administration starting in the mid-60s. The General Services Administration, I was like talking about the GSA. Does anybody know what I'm talking about? The GSA, okay, they were founded in 1949. They're the huge federal agency, and they mandate federal programming in such that they run federal properties. So if you want to find something or you want to put something in a federal building, you have to talk to the GSA. They are, by the way, the owners of the nation's New Deal art. So if you want to try to get a catalog or an understanding of the literally hundreds of thousands of objects that were made during the New Deal, the GSA is responsible for that. The GSA oversees all federal buildings. Administrative buildings like the Klaczynski Federal Building here in Chicago, and we see Alexander Calder's Flamingo. Federal Trade Building, or the International Trade Center in Washington, D.C. This is Martin Puryear's public art. The GSA oversees, meaning it commissions, and it's sort of in charge of all of the public art that is placed in American courthouses. So I have a couple different examples. This piece by Maya Lin, which is in Miami. This piece by Diana Moore, which is in Lafayette, Louisiana. And this piece by Robert Irwin, which is in San Diego. So federal courthouses, federal agencies, and also, interestingly, land port of entry. For example, in San Ysidro, which is the port of entry between Tijuana and the United States, Nori Sato did this project just a couple of years ago as the port of entry was widened from not very many lanes to, I think, 32 lanes now that go back and forth between the US and Mexico. The GSA's approach to public art was rooted in federal funding strategies from the New Deal. And here I just have a few examples of various GSA projects. In 1934, New Deal Art Projects Administrator Edward Bruce recommended that 1% of federal building cost be earmarked for public art. This establishes the percent for art programs that we see, or the percent for art model that we see in so much public art funding today. In 1963, the GSA established its Art in Architecture program using this percent for art strategy, or 0.5% in many cases. And Calder's Flamingo over here in Chicago was the first piece to be dedicated through this percent for art programming in 1974. And again, there's a mandate. If you build a federal building, one half of 1%, sometimes it's more than that, has to be devoted to public art that's either commissioned or a competition is held, or in the case of the federal courthouses, which is really interesting, it's picked by the judge. So whoever's in charge of that federal courthouse gets to literally pick Robert Irwin or Maya Lin or whoever they want as their artist of choice. I was on a GSA peer review panel a couple of years ago, and I was kind of surprised by that one. In any case, there are groups of peer professionals who jury and select public art, and this is intended to be permanent public art, which again raises the issue of permanence, because permanence, I think, is one of the things that really muddies or befuddles public art in general. So before I go too much further, let me provide a few definitions of public art. Mi-Wan Kwan, an art historian, provides a very nice description of various forms of public art. She starts off by talking about public art as an object, a thing, perhaps for civic beautification, perhaps as a form of tribute in the public sphere. So you might think, I guess the dinosaurs out there could be seen as the tribute to the dinosaur era, but in any case, they're objects in public space. There are other kinds of public art projects and programs, of course, and those are those that are engaged socially, politically, on all sorts of other different levels, and they take different forms. So public art isn't just about objects and civic beautification or paying tribute. It can be a lot more complicated, which can lead to controversy. Because one of the biggest controversies in public art has surrounded a GSA-funded project, which was Richard Serra's Tilted Arc, which Pat mentioned earlier. This was commissioned. Serra and his crew followed all the rules and regulations that he was told to follow for putting this project up in 1981. Lawsuits followed, and in 1989, it was removed after he failed to move a judge and jury in his favor. So there have been controversies. We can talk about that later if anybody's interested. Despite this GSA model of public art funding or public art modeling was copied in 28 states, and today there are over 350 art programs in the United States that follow a percent for art model. And I believe Dallas is one of them. The GSA also took the lead in commissioning site-specific artworks, including site-specific artworks by women. The federal government, in other words, not private galleries, not private collectors, not even museums, commissioned land art by women. Something to think about. Particularly with a focus on public engagement. So here we see the artists Patricia Layton and Del Geist. This work, Passage, is at the land port of entry between Eureka, Montana, and somewhere in Canada. Layton recalls that the GSA wanted a work that related to the land, and she and her partner focused on movement through the land, especially geological and glacial. So we see here a variety of Precambrian boulders, fairly large, which reference glacial movement through the landscape, but they also followed migratory patterns, north and south, not necessarily east and west, of both animals and native peoples. Another woman who has been commissioned by the GSA for these site-specific land art projects is Anita Glesta. This is her public art project, Census Walk of Numbers, and this was made in 2010 for the U.S. Census Bureau headquarters in Suitland, Maryland. Anybody ever been there? Yeah, no, right. So, but it's open and accessible, and we can actually go to Suitland, Maryland, and go see the U.S. Census Bureau. I mean, I want to support the public art that they're doing, but it's also the U.S. Census Bureau. I mean, I can't imagine a family vacation around that one, but okay, responding to the Bureau's request, or their mission, the U.S. Census Bureau has the mission of collecting data about people. Glesta designed a work that integrated the landscape surrounding this huge headquarters into a meditative pathway, meandering through the history and the meaning of counting, numbers, and data collecting. Very abstruse ideas, but she's made them concrete with these pathways, this sort of meditative lunchtime space for the employees of the U.S. Census Bureau. I think of this as a wonderful sort of space in which people who are organizing human lives can go out and understand what they're doing in terms of organizing human lives. Okay, Another approach for public art funding or programming in the 20th century in the US, of course, was the National Endowment for the Arts, Art in Public Places. And this was a program that started in 1967. The birth of the NEA, in fact, a year earlier, was the first time in US history that federal funds were allocated for arts funding beyond the spread, beyond the era of the New Deal. And they've been controversial ever since. The NEA's Art in Public Places funded more than 700 public artworks, sorry about that, from 1967 to 1995, when congressional quarrels over arts funding in general shut it down and almost killed the NEA entirely. Nancy Holt's project that we see here was created in a traffic island, incorporating her characteristic concrete forms aligned to cast shadows each year at 9:32 a.m. on August 1, the anniversary of this parcel of land's acquisition by Roslyn, Virginia founder William Henry Ross in 1860. The Holt-Smithson Foundation website remarks that this project, quote, contemplates the physical and ideological structures of land ownership while quoting the cosmos. Now, I've never actually been there on August 1 at 9:32 in the morning, but it might be something to do if you're ever in that area on August 1. Check out, see if the shadows actually are cast in the ways that Nancy Holt prescribed. This was actually the first NEA Art in Public Places Commission in 1966. It's a good example of the kind of public art that is plopped down into space. There are other sorts of phrases to describe this. It was definitely meant for civic beautification. This was part of an urban landscaping, urban reformation on the part of Grand Rapids, Michigan. The emphasis, though, was also on public engagement, public participation, public ownership, public interest. In other words, creating public art that the public actually will want to and will want to continue to respond to. And this is a success story, despite the fact that it is this massive metal red sculpture. This big red thing is loved by the city of Grand Rapids. It's on their letterhead, and it's on the sides. There are pictures of it on the sides of their garbage trucks. That, to me, is a great example of the ownership of public art in the American civic imagination. Other cities borrowed the NEA's Art in Public Places model, including Miami-Dade County, which has commissioned over 500 public art projects just in the past couple of decades. And in 1986, and we saw this example yesterday, in 1986, Beverly Buchanan was commissioned to produce blue station stones for a local metro rail station. And so we see the stones over here on the left and the bottom. These were fabricated rocks, which were deliberately dyed indigo blue. And I'm including the little Polaroid over there on the right because there was a reference to the blue being added to the stone. And then, as one of our speakers mentioned, they were recently repainted a bright, vivid blue, which isn't the color she intended. In fact, they were never meant to be painted at all. Which leads me to an interesting observation about the treatment of public art. You know, this raises questions about issues of permanence, issues of preservation, issues of conservation. Public art is like a house or a car or the human body, all of which require regular maintenance, right? But too often, we simply put it up and walk away and say we're done. We do this with all forms of public art, from memorials and monuments to projects like this as well. Dedicated and then left to the elements. For projects that are meant to be temporary, and this show is certainly full of several of those, that's fine. But for projects, public projects that are meant to be permanent, or where permanence is expected, the issue of preservation and conservation becomes quite a concern, and one I don't think that we've resolved. The problem of the deferred maintenance, not taking care of that car, that house, that body, is what surrounds the origin, the making of Fair Park Lagoon in the first place. So, as I mentioned, Leonhardt Lagoon was dedicated in 1936 for the Texas Centennial Exposition and fell apart over the decades. I mean, first of all, it's a lagoon, and it's a swamp, and it's not very deep. And as Patricia pointed out, there were all sorts of fertilizing treatments used on the grass, so that was swept into the water, creating algae blooms. It was a swampy mess, and as you said, Harry Parker, the then director of the Dallas Museum of Art, called it his old mud hole. Lovely description. So in the early 80s, the city went to the NEA Art and Public Places programming for funding. So part of the funding for this rehabilitation was out of the NEA and out of federal funding. I'll just review what Patricia said. On my first visit to Dallas, it was clear, this is from her website, it was clear that the lagoon was environmentally degraded, the shoreline was eroding, the water was murky, the Parks Department had been fertilizing, and every time it rained, fertilizer would go into the lagoon, causing algae bloom. A green slime covered the water. There was no food chain. There was hardly any plants. Basically, the lagoon was dead. Further, people had no experience of the water, except that a number of children had fallen and recently drowned. The lagoon had become a danger and an obstruction. It was a 5-block body of water surrounded by museums, but to get from one to the end, you had to walk around the entire thing. Or you could take one of those little duck boats, I guess, but it was a stretch. Okay, so she was hired to rehabilitate the site in what became a multi-million-dollar 5-year land art project. And she addressed the problems, as she pointed out, on multiple levels, aiming to create a functioning ecosystem for a wide variety of plants and animals, as well as to control the problem of erosion and to create pathways for public participation, public access on and through the waterway. She modeled her structures on several different native Texas plants, including the Delta duck potato, which has a rooted, sort of twisted root structure. I think of it like a mangrove, and it traps organic materials, and it's really perfect for the microhabitats of plants, fish, turtles, birds. And she took that model of the Delta duck potato and designed these 5-foot paths for human foot traffic and then narrower, thinner paths for turtles and for birds. This deteriorating ecosystem was revitalized into a thriving natural habitat, and this was a collaborative public art project. She worked with biologists, historians, environmentalists, local community partners. This is a project akin to another model of public art, Suzanne Lacey's idea of new genre public art. Collaborative, particularly with non-art world figures, socially and publicly focused, and also bridging institutional barriers of art, architecture, and audience. And as Anne and Patricia noted at the end of the conversation, this was repeatedly revised. I think that you write on your website the project was revised 6 different times, and in the end was actually 1/3 smaller than the original scope. But then successful public art projects are often the result of compromise. And in an art world dominated by individual intent, compromise is often seen as an aberration or a failure. And again, these are some of the conflicts between public art, land art, and how art worlds have responded. This, of course, was not a failure, but a huge success. Turtles like it, kids like it, people like it. And I'm just comparing here the earlier and later versions. In her dissertation on women, land art, and the social, Chris Timken notes that Vice President George H.W. Bush attended the opening and was in fact the first person to walk on the pathways over the water. I don't know if that was a political ploy or what, but walking on water. But I think that's pretty interesting. I also want to point out the project that you ended on talking, the draw at Sugar House in Salt Lake City, because Fair Park Lagoon is not a one of in terms of land art, public art. In 2003, the NEA sponsored a competition to redesign a pedestrian corridor at Sugar House Park in Salt Lake City. This site was formerly the site of the Utah State Prison. It was a 110-acre site with a large lake, a central pavilion, various hiking trails, and it was regularly flooded from mountain snow runoff. This park, as you can see here, is surrounded by highways, office buildings, suburban houses, growing numbers of apartment buildings and condos and gas stations and all the rest. It also attracts thousands of people per day. So this is your park in the midst of all of this building. Accessibility is a huge issue, particularly as you can see, highways surround it and flooding. Here's some other pictures of the park. And you can see that it's this low basin. So Patricia designed a public art project that moved the floodwaters into a drain basin, while also redesigning pedestrian walkways that reference, as she said, the nearby slot canyons, which were natural conduits in the corridors of the mountains where animals and people migrated between the Great Basin of Utah and the Wasatch Mountains, which is a south central section of the Rocky Mountains. The first phase of the project, which was completed in 2014, is called Echo Canyon, very popular walkway, also permitting easier access for pedestrians into this particular park. It also features a really popular climbing wall. The second phase of the project, titled Sago Lily, named after the state flower of Utah, utilizes that petal flower form that we see in quite a few of her public art projects to build flood walls in sections of this park's basin. This lily design further diverted floodwaters from the detention basin in the park to the nearby creek that had been dammed up by 19th century settlers to migrate their crops. So in a sense, this is a rehabilitation project. It's also a return to the original project. And this is what it looks like from a drone photograph. As one local newspaper described it, the draw at Sugar House, which is the title of the entire piece, was a new kind of spillway dam disguised as public art. This public art, and I love the way draw is used here, this public art is a draw on multiple levels. It's a draw, or a drawdown in engineering terms, which remediates local flooding. It's a draw as a place or a space that people want to go to. And it's also a draw, think playing cards, in that the space remains unfinished or in flux. It's dependent on public and environmental factors. It's dependent on the course of time, which we talked about a little bit yesterday. I want to believe that it will remain unfinished as things change. I think it's a great example of the continuing visibility and importance of the land art that the women of Groundswell spearheaded multiple decades ago. Thank you. I'd be happy to answer any questions, or we can all go outside and look at the dinosaurs and the lagoon. Yes?
Thank you so much for that talk. I learned so much and really, really enjoyed it.
Great.
I guess obviously you have a deep history researching the subject of public art and its kind of earlier iteration that you were discussing, but I was wondering if how much or to what extent you had explored this connection that you're describing from like public art, land art, or how much land art was a part of your scholarship prior to the invitation to present at this symposium.
That's a good question. Actually, one of my first articles was on a land artist, public artist named Andrew Lester, and I got an NEH grant in 1985 to go find Spiral Jetty, which was at under 30 feet of water. But I climbed some mountains and I still couldn't find it. Now I've been studying this stuff for a long time, so I think a even better question would be, in the earlier periods of the 20th century, when we're thinking about the public art projects under the New Deal or even earlier under the City Beautiful movement, how was the land treated? What are the environmental issues and concerns that Olmsted had in putting Central Park together, or Burnham had in mounting the City Beautiful plan in Chicago? So that would be an interesting thing to sort of talk about. Instead of plop art being positioned in those parks, what are the other ways people might be thinking about the environmental consequences, as Pat said, of these public art land-based projects? So, hope that skirted your question entirely. So, anybody else? Yes.
Thank you so much. I also learned quite a bit. I've had the pleasure of serving on the Public Art Committee for the City of Dallas's Office of Cultural Affairs. And one of the first things that really struck me when I was attending those first meetings was the definition of permanence and how the city adopted this definition. It's pretty commonplace, which is permanent is anything that will last, is expected to last 20 years. So I was really fascinated by that, and I think I'm just wondering if you can maybe speak to why that definition would be in place in the first place.
Yeah. That's a long time, actually. So many public art contracts these days are being revised to 5 and 10 years. 20 years is... It has to do with insurance. It has to do with maintenance costs, those costs that I talked about in terms of simply keeping the light bulbs in the project and making sure somebody's doing the landscaping and keeping the lawn mowed. But it also has to do, I think, with a real shift in terms of public art programming's understanding of what do we do with these 800 public art things that we've commissioned in the past 30, 40 years. Maybe we should make temporary public projects that have a lifespan, a life cycle, from birth to death, and then we move on to something else. And I'm not trying to be crass, but I am wrestling with this question. I'm writing a new book called Monuments Are Mortal, in which I'm addressing exactly that issue, that problem of permanence. But the 20-year cutoff has to do with or 10-year or 5-year, with insurance. And public artists today, if there are public artists in the room today, you'll know what I'm talking about, sign contracts regarding maintenance. And you're okay, you pay for it, here's the money, we'll take care of it for 5 years, and then boom. Which is sort of interesting. What happens to it then? So.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. I'm Lee Arnold. I'm a curator at the Nasher Sculpture Center, and I'm just going to close out the program today. But I wanted my colleague, Alyssa Arnold, thank you, Erika,
Pleasure,
to come join me at the podium as we prepare to go out onto the lagoon. I was going to just say a few things up here and then set you all loose so you don't have to sit and listen to us in the blazing heat. But Alyssa comes to us from Fair Park First, which I'll let you kind of describe what that organization is. But I just wanted to thank everybody for joining us. Alyssa's going to do an incredible, just 2-minute description. I don't know, history of this site, but especially she's done this for us before, so I'm kind of like prodding her to do it for you, which is, I was so taken with your description of kind of the previous uses of the lagoon, the cars, all that history, but also the way it was laid out and how this part of Fair Park was meant to evoke the landscape of East Texas, which is why certain parts of the lagoon have that more swampy feel to them, I would say. So I'm going to let you take it away, but before I do that, I don't know, is Patricia still here? She just stepped out. Yeah. Good. So I don't have to talk about her work in front of her. But you've already heard a lot about Fair Park Lagoon. It comprises two kind of monumental sculptures at either end of the lagoon, which serve purposes of creating pathways, creating habitats, soil erosion, et cetera. It's just a remarkable artwork and work of public art, and I'm so grateful to include it in Groundswell, because I think we should all realize how lucky we are to live just down the street, if you are from Dallas, that is, to live just down the street from an extant work of land art, ecological art, public art. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
All right.
You're up.
Okay, here we go. As Dr. Arnold said, I'm Lissa Arnold. I'm here with Fair Park. I'm the Chief Impact Officer. And I'm just going to give you a little bit of history of the site and the location you are. I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with Fair Park. You may be more familiar with how it looks now, or maybe less familiar. But we're obviously getting ready for the State Fair. It opens in 5 days. Yes, so this Friday. Hence the dinosaurs. They are not permanent. Permanent in the guise of public art and not permanent in the guise... Oh, go for it. Yeah. Did you figure out one? Let's hear it.
I did. So I wish Patricia was here to hear this, because it's quite good. Yeah. She made a work of art that did all these wonderful things, ecological remediation. She brought back a dead lagoon and created a space for it to be alive and full of things. And she was so successful that she brought dinosaurs back.
Yeah. That is the ecosystem that she built here. Dinosaurs can thrive. Anyways, so I just want to give you a little bit of history about the site. So we're here in Fair Park. We're in the Dallas Natural History Museum, the former Dallas Natural History Museum. This was built in 1936. Does anybody know what happened in 1936? Yes. So Fair Park gets most of its historic Art Deco buildings and art from the 1936 Texas Centennial Exposition. It was a World's Fair. And then the following year, we also hosted the Greater Texas and Pan American World Greater Exposition. I messed that up. Don't quote me on that one. So we hosted 2 World's Fairs back to back. That's why you get a lot of the Art Deco art here in this campus. But originally we were a fairground site. State Fair Texas originated here in 1886. And they've been here ever since then, so about 140 years. And so we kind of have this layered site here. The lagoon outside was built for the 36th centennial as well. It was built to be kind of an embodiment of an East Texas lagoon, and it is still kind of hold on to that identity. As you've kind of heard, 2 organizations, the tenants that were in this building, the Natural History Museum and the Fine Arts Museum, which was in the building to y'all's left, the original Science Place building, came together and brought in Patricia to reimagine the lagoon as it is today. Both of those tenants are no longer here. They actually, obviously DMA went to the Arts District, and then this Natural History Museum formed or combined with the Science Place Museum and the Dallas Health and Science Museum, which is also located here, and became what is known as the Pro, and they left in 2012. So what else did you want to talk about? I can keep going forever. Oh, yeah. So one of the thank you. So one of the funny things about the lagoon, so in 36, there was a building that was across from where we are right now. It's in a building that no longer exists, but on the site of what is Grand Place. And it was the Ford building, sorry about that. And they test drove their Model Ts, their Ford vehicles around the lagoon on the 7 roads of the Southwest. So there were 7 different terrains that were set up around the perimeter of the lagoon. So you can feel what it was like to be on gravel, what it's to be going up a hill. So just imagine that as you're traversing, once upon a time. What else do you want me to say? I can keep going. So I wish Patricia was here to hear a little bit more about kind of the ecology that she really brought forth with her sculpture and her partnership between the Fine Arts Museum and the Natural History Museum. But we do have a lot of turtles. I don't know if anyone noticed. They're not out quite as much right now. But we have been partnering with the Texas Turtles organization to do turtle assessments because we have so many turtles. We wanted to make sure that it was a healthy ecosystem for them here. And last year we did pull out the largest softshell turtle in Texas. Texas Monthly did do an article on the softshell turtle that just came out a couple weeks ago. So I welcome you all to learn more about this dinosaur of sorts. But yes, it is about 2.5 feet wide in diameter, the shell is. So yeah, if you see the Lady of the Lagoon, just say what's up. What's up? Due to her works that actually transformed the lagoon into an actual ecosystem, a thriving ecosystem. We have 70 or so bird waterfowl species that actually live or migrate through this this little piece of land. We have 5 different turtle species that live in the lagoon. Don't quote me on how many fish and other sorts of amphibians and lizards we have here, but we have a number of those as well. So we have a thriving ecosystem here, and it's really thanks to the work of Patricia's. Oh, I didn't know this was a question. Hi. Yes. Of course it can. Yes, yes. Please do. Please go and interact with it. Yes. We have one of your colleagues, actually, Adrian, used to roller skate on it. So I don't know why she's not here. But you can do lots of things, apparently, on it. Yeah. Yes. Yes, sir. On the work, recently we power wash it, yes. But recently we did do some patching of the gunite and stuff. So we brought in Michael Van Enter and Phoenix Restoration to do some patching of it. But actually, it's structurally extremely sound. Yeah, we had an engineer come in and check it out, and everything is great, which is surprising with foundations here in Texas. Anyways, but yeah, very minor work we have to do in the 40 years. Do I keep answering questions? Okay.
Thank you so much, Alyssa. Thank you, Alyssa. And with that, I invite everyone to brave the Texas heat and go experience Leonhardt Lagoon through Patricia Johanson's work. Thank you so much for coming today.